workshop myself, the same way I built everything else on this property. Poured the concrete floor in the fall of 1987, framed the walls over a long weekend, ran the electrical myself because I had my license and I knew what I was doing. My wife thought I was crazy for spending 3 weeks on an outbuilding when the main house still needed gutters. But I told her what I always told her. If you build something right the first time, you won't spend the rest of your life fixing it. That workshop became the best room on the property. Better than the kitchen, better than the living room with the big stone fireplace she loved. I had my tools hung in order by size. I had a workbench I'd built from reclaimed oak, 12 feet long, solid as a ship. I had a stool in the corner where my wife used to sit and drink her coffee and watch me work on Saturday mornings, and she never said much, just sat there, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Her name was Margaret. She passed 4 years ago this coming October. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I was 63 years old, and I did not know what to do with a house that size and that quiet, so I went back to the workshop and I kept building things. Birdhouses at first, then furniture for people in town who asked, then nothing in particular, just working the wood because the wood didn't ask anything of me except attention. And attention I had plenty of. My nephew's name is Brandon. He is my older brother's son, and my brother passed 8 years ago from a heart attack, so Brandon had been coming around since then with what I can only describe as a slow, patient kind of interest in my welfare. He called every few weeks. He visited on holidays. He helped me move a refrigerator one spring and didn't make a big show of it, just showed up and helped and left. I appreciated that. I told people he was a good kid. I believed it. He was 34 years old. He worked in sales, some kind of software company, and he had a girlfriend named Tanya who smiled with her whole face and brought food whenever they visited. Casseroles mostly. Good ones. I liked them both. I said so. I told my neighbor Dale more than once that it was a comfort, having family who actually showed up. The property is 11 acres in western Pennsylvania. The house sits on a hill with a long gravel driveway, and you can see 3 counties on a clear day from the back porch. I built the house in 1984, the year Margaret and I got married. I was a structural engineer for the county for 31 years, and before that I worked construction summers through college and 2 years after. I know how things are made. I know what holds and what doesn't. The land was worth something. I understood that. Land out here has been going up steadily, and the house is solid, and the workshop and the barn and the 2 smaller outbuildings are all in good shape because I maintained them. I didn't think much about what it was worth in dollar terms, because it wasn't going anywhere. I planned to be carried out of that house. I'd told my attorney that a man named Gerald, who I'd worked with for 20 years, and he'd written it into the language of my will accordingly. What I did not anticipate was Brandon. It started small, the way these things do. He began asking questions about the property at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. Just curious questions, he said. Do you have the deed in a safe place? Do you have a current appraisal? Have you thought about what happens if something happens to you? Good questions, on the surface. Reasonable questions for a nephew who cared about his uncle. I answered them. I told him everything was in order with Gerald. He nodded and seemed satisfied and helped himself to more turkey. But the questions kept coming. Not every visit, not obviously, but steadily. He mentioned that a neighbor 2 miles down the road had sold 50 acres to a developer for more than I would have guessed possible. He mentioned that land values were really moving and that it would be a shame if I didn't have a plan. He mentioned a friend of his who worked in estate planning. He mentioned once, almost as a passing thought, that the probate process could be difficult and expensive for heirs if things weren't structured properly. I listened to all of it. I didn't say much. I'm not a man who says much when I'm thinking. What I was thinking was, I have known this boy since he was 7 years old. I taught him to use a hand plane when he was 12. I drove 3 hours to watch him graduate college, and something has changed in the way he talks about my house. Something has changed in the way his eyes move around the room when he thinks I'm not looking. I did not say any of this out loud. I called Gerald instead. Gerald and I talked for an hour. I told him what I'd noticed. He listened the way good attorneys listen, which is without interrupting. When I was done, he asked me 2 questions. Did I have any documentation of the conversations? And had Brandon ever asked me to sign anything? The answer to both was no. Gerald said to keep my eyes open and to call him if anything changed. He also suggested we revisit the structure of the estate, not because anything was wrong, but because it was a good time anyway. He said there were options that would give me more protection. I told him to draw them up and I'd come in the following week. That was 14 months before the day everything broke open. In those 14 months I did 3 things that Brandon did not know about. First, I met with Gerald and restructured the property into a revocable living trust with specific language about what could and could not be transferred under what circumstances. Second, I updated my will to make it explicit that the property was to go to the land conservancy I'd been supporting for 15 years, with a small cash portion to Brandon and to Margaret's sister in Ohio, and I had Gerald keep the specifics between us. Third, I bought and installed a security camera system, 4 cameras outside, 2 inside the workshop, 1 in the hallway of the house near my home office, not because I thought I needed them, exactly, because I am a structural engineer, and structural engineers do not wait for a bridge to fail before they check the load-bearing members. I told Dale about the cameras. Dale is 71, retired electrician, lives a quarter-mile down the road, and he has known me for 26 years. I gave him the login for the camera app on his phone, and I told him that if he ever saw something that looked wrong, or if I called him and said a specific word, the word was Tuesday, which had no significance whatsoever, he should call the county sheriff and give them the camera login and tell them to send someone to my property. He looked at me over his fence and said, "You think Brandon's going to pull something?" I said I didn't know. I said I hoped I was wrong. He said he hoped so too. He took down the login. Tanya came by herself one afternoon in March, which she had never done before. She was friendly, the way she always was, and she brought a lemon pound cake. And we sat at the kitchen table and she talked about work and the weather, and then she said, very carefully, that Brandon had been under a lot of stress lately. Financial stress. She didn't say more than that, just financial stress. But the way she said it made the shape of the problem clear. I nodded and said I was sorry to hear it. She went home 40 minutes later and left the pound cake, which was very good, and I sat at the table for a long time after. 2 weeks after that, Brandon called and asked if he could come by on a Saturday to help me clean out the barn. I said yes. I told him to come around 9. He arrived at 8:30 with Tanya, and with a man I didn't know, who he introduced as his friend Marcus. Marcus was wide through the shoulders, not unfriendly, but he had the particular quality of a man who is there to do a specific thing and is waiting for the moment to do it. I shook his hand and noticed that Brandon was talking a little too much, the way people do when they are nervous, and that he kept glancing at Tanya, and she kept her eyes on the ground. We worked in the barn for about an hour. It went normally enough. Then Brandon said he wanted to show Marcus my workshop, because Marcus was apparently interested in woodworking. I said sure, and we walked across the yard, and I opened the workshop and we went inside. What happened next took about 4 minutes from start to finish. Brandon closed the workshop door. He said my name. He said, "Uncle Ray, I need you to listen to me for a minute, and I need you not to get upset." I looked at him. I did not say anything. He said that he was in serious trouble financially, that he had debts I didn't know about, that he was going to lose his apartment, and that he needed help. I said I was sorry and asked what kind of help. He said he needed me to sign a quitclaim deed transferring the property into a joint tenancy with him. He said it was just a formality, just protection for both of us, just a way to make sure that if anything happened to me, the property didn't get tied up in probate. He said he had the paperwork in the car. I said no. He said he understood my hesitation, but that Gerald might not have explained all the options to me, and he had someone who could walk me through it in plain language. I said I had been working with Gerald for 20 years, and I was satisfied with his explanations. Brandon's jaw tightened. Marcus moved, not toward me, but toward the workshop door. He turned the interior latch. The click was very quiet, but I heard it. I understood then what I had been preparing for. Brandon's voice changed. He stopped talking like a nephew and started talking like someone who had been waiting a long time to say a specific set of words. He said that the property was worth more than I understood. He said that I was 67 years old and living alone on 11 acres, and that I was not being realistic about the future. He said that he had consulted with someone who told him that if I was found to be not managing my affairs properly, there were legal avenues to address that. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant that there were ways to have a guardian appointed. He said this quietly, like he was telling me the weather. Tanya had not said anything. She was standing near the workbench with her arms crossed and her eyes still on the floor. I said, "Brandon, I am not going to sign anything." Marcus stepped in front of the door. Brandon said that they weren't leaving until we had an agreement, that he had the paperwork and I was going to look at it, and that I should think carefully before I decided to be difficult about this. He said the word difficult with a particular kind of patience that made it clear he had rehearsed this conversation several times. I looked at my workshop. I had built it myself. I knew every inch of it. I knew the workbench I'd made from reclaimed oak. I knew the third drawer on the left side, the one that stuck slightly in humidity and that I had to lift and pull at a specific angle to open. I knew what was in it. I said, All right, let me sit down. This is a lot to hear. Brandon visibly relaxed. People always relax when they think they've won. That is a thing I have noticed over 67 years. I walked to the workbench slowly, the way a man my age walks when he is processing difficult information. I sat down on my stool. I put my hand on the third drawer. I felt Brandon watching me. I lifted the drawer slightly and pulled at the angle, and it opened. Inside was a phone, fully charged, set to silent. It had been in that drawer for 11 months. I had charged it every 2 weeks on a schedule I kept in my head. I also had, in the back of that same drawer, a folded document. It was a letter from Gerald summarizing the trust structure, with a cover page that listed the trust account number and the name of the conservancy. I had put it there 6 months ago during one of my bi-weekly charging sessions, because I am a man who thinks about load-bearing members. I did not move quickly. I opened the phone under the lip of the workbench and I dialed Dale's number, and when he answered after 2 rings, I said, "Dale, Tuesday." Then I set the phone face down on the workbench. Brandon said, "Who was that?" I said, "Nobody. An old friend." He said, "What did you say to them?" I said I'd call them back. He watched me for a moment. Then he set the folder of documents on the workbench in front of me and opened it. He began explaining the quitclaim deed. He spoke for about 6 minutes. I listened and I looked at the papers, and I did not sign anything. At 17 minutes after he'd made his call, I heard tires on the gravel driveway. Brandon heard them too. He went to the workshop window. I watched his face change. 2 sheriff's department vehicles had come up the drive, and behind them was Dale's truck. Brandon turned to me. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I made a phone call." He said, "You don't understand what you just did. You're going to regret this." I said, "Brandon, I want you to look around this room. I want you to look at the cameras in the upper corners, there and there. And I want you to understand that everything that happened in this room in the last 25 minutes has been recorded with audio. And then I want you to think about what an attorney would call what just happened here." He looked at the cameras. His face did a complicated series of things. Marcus unlocked the workshop door and opened it before the deputies had to knock. I will tell you what came out of the 14 months of camera footage, because I think it matters. There were 3 other visits in which Brandon made statements that the district attorney's office later described as relevant. There was a phone call, captured on the interior hallway camera during one of his visits when he stepped away to take a call, in which he could be heard discussing the property's estimated value with a third party and asking about timelines. There was a text conversation that the investigation turned up between Brandon and Marcus, in which they discussed, in fairly specific terms, the plan for the Saturday in March, including how to handle it if I didn't cooperate. Brandon was charged with criminal coercion, attempted fraud, and false imprisonment. Marcus was charged with false imprisonment and conspiracy. The false imprisonment charge applied because turning a latch and physically blocking a door while delivering threats is, under Pennsylvania law, false imprisonment regardless of whether you use physical force. I did not know that until Gerald explained it to me, but I was glad to learn it. Tanya was not charged. I do not know what she knew beforehand or how much she understood about what was planned. She called me once, 3 weeks after the arrest, and she said she was sorry. She sounded like she meant it. I said thank you for calling, and I wished her well, and I meant that too. The legal process took the better part of a year. I drove to the courthouse 4 times. Gerald managed most of it. Brandon eventually pleaded to a reduced charge of coercion and received 2 years of supervised probation and a fine, and was ordered to have no contact with me. Marcus pleaded to a lesser charge as well. No one went to prison, which my neighbor Dale found unsatisfying. I was less focused on that. What I wanted was a legal record that said, "This happened, it was wrong, here are the consequences." That record exists. The property is still mine. It will go, when the time comes, to the Land Conservancy. The same one Margaret and I used to donate to every year at Christmas. The one that protects riparian buffers and old-growth woodlots and the kind of land that doesn't come back once it's gone. I updated the trust documents after everything was resolved, just to make sure the language was airtight. Gerald said it was the clearest instrument he'd drawn up in 30 years. People ask me why I didn't confront Brandon earlier. Why I didn't say, when the question started, that I saw what he was doing and he needed to stop. And I understand the question. But here is what I know about structural failure. It rarely happens because of one bad event. It happens because a flaw develops slowly, and the flaw is ignored or undetected, and the load keeps being applied, and by the time anyone acts, the damage is already extensive. The right response to a developing flaw is not to tap on it and warn it, The right response is to quietly reinforce the structure and document the flaw and be ready for the moment it manifests. I reinforced. I documented. I was ready. There is something I think about, though. Not about Brandon exactly. About my brother. My brother was a good man. A straightforward man. A man who worked hard and kept his word and was proud of his son. He died believing Brandon was going to be all right. I don't know what happened between then and the March morning in my workshop. Debt, maybe. Pressure. Tanya mentioned financial stress. People do things under pressure that they would not otherwise do. That doesn't make the things acceptable. But I am 67 years old and I have seen enough of life to know that understanding how something happened is not the same as excusing it. I still go to the workshop on Saturday mornings. I've been building a roll-top desk, nothing commissioned, just something to build. The wood is quarter-sawn white oak from a mill 2 counties east of here, clean and straight-grained, and it moves through the planer with a sound that is one of the better sounds in the world. Dale comes over sometimes and sits in the corner with his coffee the way Margaret used to do. He doesn't say much, neither do I. That's enough. The cameras are still up. I don't imagine I'll take them down. They have become part of the property now, part of how the property works, the same way the electrical system is part of it and the drainage field is part of it and the deep anchor tie-downs I put on the workshop roof back in 1991 are part of it. Things you install because you understand the conditions. Things that, if you do your job right, you hope you never need. The stool where Margaret used to sit is in the northeast corner near the window. I don't move it. On clear mornings, the light comes in at an angle that catches the dust in the air and it looks like something is standing there, something light and patient and not in any hurry. I don't say anything when that happens. I just keep working. That is what you do. You build carefully, you plan for what you cannot predict, you keep the things you love in a form that outlasts the people who would take them. And then you go back inside, pour the coffee, listen to the house settle in the cold, and you are grateful for every ordinary quiet morning that nobody tried to take from you.